So welcome everyone. Very nice to have you all here with us. My name is Dora, I'm one of the organizers of Qesher. The other is Sebastian. You can find us both here. We started this project almost 4 years ago now, and our aim has been to introduce Jewish communities from all over the world. We normally do kind of virtual tours or sessions in which we learn about history or heritage. And just in the last few months, more or less, we started a new series, which is the Qesher Book Club. Probably many of you have attended previous book clubs in which we introduce books that have some sort of Jewish themes related to Jews all over the world. So we are still on the same kind of stories, but we realize that many of these stories don't just cover one city or one place, but they are one family and may cover different continents and cities and parts of the world. So we are very happy to learn about these books and find out what is good to read these days. So we are very happy to welcome Jordan Salama, who is going to be our speaker today. And I'm just going to say a few words about him. He's a writer focusing on culture and the environment in the Americas. He's the author of Every Day the River Changes, a Kirkus Review's Best Book of the Year. His work has appeared in National Geographic, the New York Times, All Things Considered, and other publications. In 2022, he was on the staff of National Geographic, where he wrote digital and print stories and served as a guest host for the flagship podcast Overheard at Nat Geo. An American writer of Argentine, Syrian, and Iraqi Jewish descent, Salama graduated from Princeton University in 2019. He has been based in recent years between New York and Buenos Aires. So that's the short bio of Jordan, and he's going to introduce himself, of course, more in detail. And he's going to share with us today about his book, which is called Stranger in the Desert, a family story. So I'm going to pass the word to Jordan. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we will have time at the end of the presentation, more or less in about 40 minutes or so, for Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Dora, and thank you, Sebastian. I'm so grateful to be here. This is such a wonderful program and really speaks to, I guess, the themes and topics that inspire so much of my work, which are these Jewish histories around the world, because I contain many of them in my own history. So it's really, really, really wonderful to be here. And I'm very excited to hear from all of you too. I see that people are already putting comments into the chat who are reading the book or who haven't read the book or who are connected to Argentina, or maybe you're connected to Syria or Iraqi Jews. Be it what it may, I would love to hear from you throughout. So feel free throughout the conversation to put your comments or your questions in the chat. And when I'm done with my initial presentation, we'll get to that very soon. So I have some slides here that I want to share with you all. This is my book, Stranger in the Desert, but this is how I'm going to start, because this is me. This is me, Jordan, on the train across Patagonia in southern Argentina. My name is Jordan Salama, and I'm a writer who tells stories of the world. Above all, my work tries to foster a greater sense of cross-cultural understanding and respect for the natural world through deeply reported stories of the human experience. So behind everything that I write are those conversations that you can only have by hanging out for a while, by knocking on doors and going on hikes and getting to really know a place and its history. In my adventures writing for places like National Geographic and the New York Times and Smithsonian, I've journeyed down rivers in Colombia, taken the train across the United States, explored migrant-rich neighborhoods of New York City, and followed Jewish trade routes through the Andes Mountains of Argentina, which is why I'm here today. And some people ask me how I got—
Could you speak more slowly, please?
Oh, yeah, no problem. Sure thing. Okay. So this is a phrase in Arabic that is called kan ya makan. I don't know if anybody has heard this phrase before. Maybe a show of hands, shaking heads. I'm looking through here to see. No, shaking heads. Kan ya makan. And also, I don't know what happened here, but the chat got in my way, so I'm trying to move that out. Hold on one second. Sorry about that.
You
Okay,
want you to close the chat, and if there's anything relevant, we can tell you because it's hard to
do it at the same time. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so kanya makan, which is the Arabic phrase for once upon a time. And the literal translation of kanya makan in one of its interpretations is it happened or it didn't happen. It was so or it wasn't so. And I like that idea that the beginning of a story, once upon a time, includes this kind of mention of doubt, which when it comes to family storytelling, which is what I've been thinking about a lot recently, is definitely true. We don't know how many of these stories are true. We don't know what's legend and what's fact, but it's our job as the family historian to try to figure it out. So here's a recording of a family member of mine reading some family stories that start with Kanya Makan in Arabic. Does that work? Oh no. Maybe not. No. Okay, so I'll skip that then. But basically, it's just to say that in Arabic, any story begins with Kani Makan. And that story can be a story that's told across a kitchen table. It can be a tale as grand as one of the fables of the 1001 Nights. But for me, as a kid growing up in the suburbs of New York, when I heard Kani Makan, it always meant that a family story was coming. This is a painting painted by my grandmother, who was born, my grandmother's brother, who was born in Baghdad, Iraq, of relatives sitting around a charcoal brazier under the covers of my great-great-great-grandmother's bed in Baghdad, as she told them stories of our family trading on the Silk Road. This is my version of Kanya Makan, which is my way of telling stories and recording the lived histories of people across the Americas and in the Middle East and in the United States and beyond. Because the truth is that, again, while I was born and raised in the United States, my family kind of comes from everywhere. My mom was born in Baghdad, Iraq, and when she was 6 years old in the 1970s, hers was one of the last Iraqi Jewish families to flee the country and seek refuge in the United States. My dad was born in Brooklyn to Argentine parents from Buenos Aires, whose ancestors migrated to Latin America from Damascus and Aleppo in Ottoman Syria. So I'm a big mix of things. When I was growing up, I heard English, I heard Spanish, I heard multiple dialects of Arabic, I heard Hebrew, French, spoken by relatives scattered around the world. But with Kanya Makan, with this Arabic phrase for once upon a time, that's always how things started. It was always Kanya Makan, even if we didn't speak fluent Arabic ourselves. So how does this manifest itself in my life and in my career? By the time I got to college, after hearing so many of these oral stories, oral histories of our family trading on the great trade routes of the world between Iraq and Syria and Latin America, I realized that I wanted to become a writer. Writing about the world, I realized, could maybe be a way of remembering my path through it. So I was really lucky to have been able to study with some brilliant writers like Pico Iyer and John McPhee, who some of you might have read or heard of before. I caught the bug and I started to look outward in search of news stories, often in places and languages that felt familiar to me. So this was my first big project, and it was my thesis when I was an undergrad, which was following a river in Colombia called the Magdalena. And going along this river, I met ordinary people living all along its path and wrote about a country in conflict and in transition. So I interviewed kids, I crossed rickety bridges over rivers, I interviewed canoe builders, sand diggers, went on expeditions with biologists looking for invasive hippopotamuses, river turtles, kites, all sorts of colorful stories along this wonderful river. And after a long while of telling stories about my own, places that were foreign to me, I wanted to turn my gaze back to my own family's history. And it so happened that a couple of years ago, I came across an old book on my grandfather's basement desk in Peekskill, New York, in the suburbs, just about an hour north of New York City. And in that book was labeled in Spanish, Historia Antigua, the ancient history, the ancient history. And when I opened it, I saw in my grandfather's distinct Argentine script 500 years of our family's wandering past that had been recorded for the very first time. Clearly, it was something that had been passed down from generation to generation. Abuelo, in fact, even mentioned that it was a story that he had been told by his father on the eve of his bar mitzvah. But what he didn't know was that in that book, there was a mystery. And for a long time, I started reading it and hearing the stories and speaking with Abuelo, who's 95 years old and still works as a doctor in Peekskill. Started reading that book and uncovered this mystery, which was that my grandfather's father, an immigrant named Salim Salama, who was born in Damascus in Ottoman Syria and made it to Argentina in the beginning of the 20th century, he moved to a city called Mendoza, and he worked as a traveling salesman in the Andes Mountains on a horse-drawn cart, selling textiles and clothes and other goods to families in the remote highlands of Argentina. This to me was very new. I thought, this is strange. A Syrian Jewish immigrant moving about the Argentinian Andes is not something that you would necessarily expect. However, there was something else, which was that in the Jewish neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, there were rumors that my great-grandfather not only traveled in this way through the Andes Mountains, but that he also left behind these long-lost children, these long-lost descendants, and that perhaps there was an opportunity for me to go looking for them. So that's what I did. And that's what this book is about, that I'm here to talk to you about today. But more than just a journey across Argentina looking for these long-lost relatives of mine, these lost Salamas, it's also a journey about identity, about discovery, about family storytelling, and why it's important to maintain intergenerational stories, in all aspects of our lives as a way of preserving memory and preserving identity and cultural heritage. So with that in mind, I took this project on thinking that I wanted to go about a family history search in new and novel ways, not necessarily relying on DNA tests or on documents which were really hard to find and difficult to come by. In my case, my family's history, besides this Historia Antigua, was not that well documented in terms of formal birth certificates and grave sites and things like that past one generation. So I wanted to use my own skills, my tools as a journalist and a reporter to dig deep and follow my own family's past, which was a very, very interesting, an interesting experience. Now, what I'd love to do while we're talking about all of this, while I start to get into kind of these themes of identity and storytelling and all the rest, I'd love to hear about some of your experiences with family stories. So if you'd like to put in the chat how your family preserves its history, the different ways perhaps that a family preserves its history. Is it in a book like the Historia Antigua? Is it in the form of music? Is it in the form of objects? To think about these things and put a little bit about that into the chat, I think that would be really lovely so that I can then work off of that in this conversation. So, but in the meantime, I'll show you some more pictures. So I want to put some faces to the names here. So this is me once again in Argentina. But this is my grandfather, Abuelo, the 95-year-old doctor who I mentioned, who has this very special Historia Antigua, which looks about like this. So the Historia Antigua is, you could call it one binder, the binder that's open on his desk, or you could call it this entire collection, this beautiful basement library that has magazines and stamp collections and special stones that are labeled with the places where he's been. Let's see if I could find that. Oops. Stones. I don't have the stones here. Stones and handicrafts and special items and all sorts of things. Every single bit of information in the Historia Antigua is contained in these very different objects, these very special items that Abuelo has. And he was the only one who was the keeper of them. He was the only one who understood its order, who could make sense of its madness, which I think is really interesting too, until I started reading it. And for a while, it was surprising to me that he had never told us anything about this, that he had all this information that was in the basement, but it took somebody to take the time to ask and to read it with him before Abuelo would reveal these family histories that he had up here all along. And I think that it's actually very common in families in the United States that have not too long ago come from somewhere else to have this kind of experience, to be reluctant to necessarily share stories of the past or to pass on a first language to a new generation of Americans, because of certain traumas related to it, or feelings that maybe the next generation is not interested. And so that is definitely a barrier to this kind of intergenerational storytelling that's so important. However, there are ways to uncover these stories. And again, behind every object, there are living stories that remain. So one of the strategies that I employed was actually going bit by bit across my grandparents' house over the course of years in preparing for this search for the long lost salamas, and then years later, asking about the stories behind every object. So here's a good example. People probably know what this is on the right-hand side. Can people nod if they've ever seen what this is? Yeah, this is a nargila, which is a pipe for smoking hookah. And for all my life, ever since I was a very, very young kid, this pipe was sitting out of use on my grandparents' bookshelf, weighed down with salt. It only took, the beginning of this project to start to manifest itself before I realized that that hookah pipe was actually brought over to Argentina by my great-great-grandmother from Damascus. And not only that the pipe itself, once I got to Argentina and uncovered the search and went to the places that were significant for my family, realized that if you could make it out on the right-hand photo, that she's smoking that same pipe in the picture on her tombstone. This is what I mean about these discoveries that can happen once you start to open the portals and open doors and dive down rabbit holes and start conversations and ask questions. So that was kind of the setup for this journey was, okay, I need to tell this story to as many people as possible to see if anybody has an understanding of what's going on here. And if anybody can shed light onto this family story that I never knew I had within my own family. So I'm going to pause for 1 second. And I'm going to see here what you've written in the chat about how your family preserves its history, because this is really important. So one person says we have pictures, but I also made a DNA test. Another person also says pictures. Someone says they interviewed family members. That's amazing. Immigration documents, family origins charts, stories, packing belongings in a small backpack, compiling family history in book form, being able to update with family online, family myths. Much has been lost about, but our Sephardi family preserves through recipes. Recipes is a wonderful way, right? Let's see a show of hands of whose family preserves their stories through recipes. That's amazing. And not only the recipes themselves, I'm sure, but the act of cooking with our relatives is a way of getting these stories together. Wow, so many people are writing here. This is amazing. So yeah, so there's all these ways of kind of preserving our history, but I happen to have this great privilege that already a journalist, I uncovered this binder on my grandfather's desk that kind of had everything that I needed. And if you want, I'll read an excerpt from the book right now that tells a little bit about what it was like to find that book. Okay. It was by far the largest one on the shelf, a hulking 5-inch monster thick with life, stuffed with plastic sleeves and loose yellowing papers and photographs falling out the bottom and the sides. I laid the thing carefully on the desk and opened it to the first page. Written in Spanish, this is how it began. I'm not sure what it is that I'm about to write, but I've had this idea for a number of years now, ever since a conversation I had with my father when I turned 13 and had my bar mitzvah. Clearly, it was Abuelo's handwriting. I could tell by the very characteristically Argentine script, marked by irregular capitalization. My father called me upstairs around sunset, after the religious ceremony and a small party that's always customary after a boy becomes a man. What my father said then has stuck with me ever since, burrowed away in a corner of my brain, and every now and then it crosses my mind. He began to tell me the ancient history. The next few pages went on to describe, in stunning detail, the story of our family's movements dating back more than 500 years. It recorded an oral history passed down for something like a dozen generations, and this was almost certainly the first time such a story had been written down. The Historia Antigua spoke of the family's time in Spain during the medieval period, when the Islamic dynasties ruled and Sephardic Jews lived under the Umayyad and Abbasid empires. When in 1492 the Spanish monarchy issued the Alhambra decree, forcing non-Catholics to either convert or flee, Abuelo wrote, "The majority of the family took boats, which cost a fortune, and disembarked in Rhodes, others in Salonika. In the Historia Antigua, I quickly learned time moved in increments of centuries, not single years. The family in Rhodes," it continued, "now reduced, eventually decided to go to the mainland of the Ottoman Empire and establish themselves in Smyrna. In Smyrna, they lived for several centuries more, speaking Old Judeo-Spanish, Ladino, for they never forgot about life in Spain. But little by little, they began spreading throughout the vast Turkish Empire. Some went to Alexandria, others to Damascus, and others yet to Jerusalem and Jaffa. They were marked not only by the name Salama, common across the Arab world, but also by a second surname, Ibn Hudaye, its exact meaning hardly agreed upon, but Abuelo thought it meant son of Jews. Abuelo wrote now in the first person once more, I come from the family that installed itself in Damascus. They spoke Arabic. The Ladino, which by that point no one understood, had been lost but for a few words. And the Hebrew, once spoken for so many centuries, was now only spoken during prayer. And they repeated it like parrots. And like parrots, they did not understand what they were saying. At some point, almost all of the young male Jews began to leave the Ottoman Empire because religious minorities were being conscripted and sent to the army for many years. My father, Salim Salama, boarded a boat bound for Argentina. There he married my mother, Faride Cohen Hop, and had 14 children, of whom 8 survived past 1 year of life. The survivors were, in order of appearance, David, Amelia, Jacobo Alberto, Teresa, Jacobo II, Isel, Moises, me, and Elias. So astounded by my discovery, I spent a lot of time with this book and uncovering it and all sorts of things because it was a geniza of sorts, a kind of treasure trove of recollections, of remembrance, and of research. And I found this strange thing happening to me, which was that I began to feel nostalgia for worlds that I myself had not inhabited before, my grandparents' worlds. I began to think and long for places like Argentina, and even places like Damascus, where there are very few Jews left. And as a Jewish person living in the United States, it's almost impossible to go. So this was a kind of a several months period that happened when I was reading this until we discovered this mystery. And then I decided, with Abuelo by my side, to set off. And this is a perfect timing for a question that just appeared in the chat, which is, in what year did my family leave Syria? So the history here is really important to understand too, is that in Damascus and Aleppo, the 2 cities in Syria where the Jewish community was kind of split into 2 populations of about 12,000 people each at the turn of the 20th century, people started to leave at the end of the 19th century for a number of reasons. At the beginning, it was because most of them worked as traveling salespeople on the Silk Road. And as the Suez Canal was finished in Egypt in the mid to late 19th century, that meant that land trading populations like Damascus went into deep economic decline. So life became very difficult very quickly. And then around 1909, when the Young Turks Revolution, as the Ottoman Empire was weakening, created these nationalistic reforms that meant that Jews and Christians, or any non-Muslims, had to be conscripted for mandatory terms of service to the army. That meant that there was a huge wave of migration of Jewish and Christian immigrants out of Syria and Lebanon, many of whom went to Latin America. In my family's case, this was around 1910. In others, it happened around 1905. For others, it was even earlier, 1900. And for some, it was later, in the 1920s and 1930s. There was a lot of poverty and a lot of economic hardship, of course. And there was, yes, there was a blood libel accusation, as somebody writes in the comments too. That was in the late 19th century. So there was a bunch of things that were kind of building up. And then this conscription order led to this great wave. And what happened in my family? My family, it was the case that my great-grandfather Salim left Syria with a little brother of his, with a little brother of a family friend whose name was also Salim. And they made it to Buenos Aires, to the Syrian Jewish neighborhoods of Barracas and Flores and El Once. And then very quickly, Salim went to the Andes to try to work as a traveling salesman in a horse-drawn cart. So what did I do? I followed his route. He traveled from, hang on one second here, I'll show you. This is a map of Argentina. So as we can see, Buenos Aires, the capital, is a port city on the Rio de la Plata. And then the other cities, which are in the northwestern Andes, are Mendoza, San Juan, Catamarca, Tucumán, Salta, Jujuy, La Quiaca. These are larger towns, some of them small cities. And then in between you have the smaller towns, Chilecito, Cafayate, Campo Quijano, Tilcara, Villazón in Bolivia. This was the path, the general path, that my great-grandfather took. And this was the path that I followed over the course of several weeks, looking for his long-lost relatives. And I had no information about what he did or how he worked. I was kind of just going in blind. And so I employed a number of strategies to spread my story far and wide. One of which was I went on local radio stations and local newspapers and broadcast my search and said, my name is Jordan and I'm coming from the United States looking for this lost lineage. I would read out my email address and I would say, if anybody has any information for me, please let me know. And as a result, we built this kind of chain of trust, and people would call me into their homes in towns like Chilecito and Campo Quijano, asking after more information, and in some cases presenting me to people who thought were my long-lost relatives. In the process, I met so many interesting people. I met traveling salespeople who still work today along these routes. I met folk singers and shepherds. I met Syrian families that are still living in the Andes Mountains, and we cooked Syrian comfort food together, like lahmacun, sficha, hummus, baba ganoush. It was really special. And all of this kind of led to this realization, which was that my family was not alone. I think that when we're working on our family history projects, it's often the case where we feel like, wow, our stories are so unique and so different. And my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother must have been the only person to work and live in this way. In reality, though, our family stories, and especially Jewish family stories of migration, they don't happen in a vacuum. And it very soon became apparent to me that it was actually extremely common for Syrian Jewish immigrants to Argentina to work as traveling salesmen in the countryside. They worked in Patagonia, they worked in the Pampas, they worked in the Andes. They mostly worked in the Andes, though, because the climate of the northwestern Andes of Argentina is extraordinarily similar to the climate of the Levant, so they felt at home. They worked with farmers who sold olives and grew apricots and walnuts, and they felt like they were in a familiar place. So it was really interesting to kind of start to put all the pieces together of what the story was. What was that narrative? Not just the kind of physical traces of my great-grandfather, but what was the narrative propelling him to work in this way, which was really interesting. So this is a picture of me. This is me in Cafayate in a river valley looking out over the countryside. And it kind of looks like a painting. It's such a vast and empty landscape with just trickles of rivers. In most cases, they're the kind of high deserts and high mountains, which is really, it's a spectacular landscape. And so, yeah, this is Cafayate, and there's so many other, beautiful photos that I have on my social media, on my Instagram page. Unfortunately, in the book, there's no pictures, but this is kind of what the mountains often look like. Here we go. So that's that. Now I see there's more and more things here. So somebody wrote, my father went to Mexico. So it was the case that these Syrian Jews didn't only go to Argentina, but they also went to Mexico and Panama and Venezuela and New York. And that was because when they got on these boats and they said, take me to America, sometimes they didn't exactly know where they were going and they would get sent to South America instead, which was the experience of my family. I also had family who kind of diverted to Mexico. So anyway, this book, what this book tries to do is it tries to reconstruct that journey of looking for your family's past. It's not just my narrative of what I went through, but it also includes snippets from the Historia Antigua. It includes old maps, clips from Facebook groups that I posted on looking for answers, transcripts from those radio segments and newspapers. And it tries to kind of organize it all as a pastiche, as the Historia Antigua does itself. This kind of really special and diverse collection of materials that help you understand your family's history. With that, I want to show you one more thing, and then I want to open it up for questions. What I would like to show you is perhaps one of the greatest treasures that I found in my wanderings through the Andes, which was a family that showed me this. Can everybody see that? So this is a really special map that I have never really seen anywhere else, but it's one of these things that is forwarded along by word of mouth. It was hand drawn by a Syrian Jew who moved to Mexico, and then it was digitized in this way. But it's a map of the Jewish quarter of Damascus. And the map of this Jewish quarter of Damascus is so special because every purple square that you see is a house that corresponds to a family. And the list of numbers on the side are the family names that correspond to the houses. So what Syrian Jews in Latin America, at least, are able to do is take a look at this map and realize where their family lived in the old quarter, the old Jewish quarter of Damascus. My family appears here as Familia Huedae, which is that second last name that I mentioned. And then there's other last names that are super common that are here as well. But what's really amazing is if you look at the collection of names, it shows you just how diverse the Syrian Jewish community is. You have names like Lisbona and Romano, which suggest families that came from Lisbon or Rome. You have last names that suggest professions like Helweni, which is sweets, or Laham, which is a butcher. And it shows you that this is just a very, very diverse community that came from Sephardic descended Jews. There were Mizrahi Jews who have been in the area, in the region of the Levant and Mesopotamia for thousands and thousands of years. And this map is a perfect kind of symbol of understanding that there's so much nuance to these family stories, and that I was on this journey of just starting to break open the ice and try to understand what I was about to find. So with that, I would love to open it up to questions, because I think that there's much more to talk about if we can have this be an interactive conversation now that you have an idea of what this book is about. I would encourage you to actually speak if you have a question.
Okay, thank you so much, Jordan, for introducing us the main points of your book. And now we will go into questions. There are already some in the chat, so I'm gonna read them out. But if someone wants to raise their hand, I would like to ask to raise hands and not just unmute, so I can follow a bit better the order of the questions. So, did any of the Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews settle in the Baron Hirsch colonies?
Okay. So for those of us who don't know, the Baron Hirsch colonies, the first Jewish immigration to Argentina occurred at the end of the 19th century, when the philanthropist Baron de Hirsch brought people out of Eastern Europe, mostly what's today Russia and Ukraine, on boats. The most famous boat was called La Pampa, and settled Jews in agricultural colonies in the Pampas of Argentina. These were all Ashkenazi Jews, though. There's a lot of great books about it. There's one called The Jewish Gauchos. There's one written by a friend of mine called The Murders of Moisesville. But these were all Ashkenazi Jews. Whereas the Sephardic Jews, the Syrian Jews who came later, largely went to sell independently in the provinces, like in the Andes, like I'm talking about with my family's history. So no, they were not in the Baron Hirsch colonies.
Richard? And then I'll go
thanks,
back
Dora.
to the chat.
Hi. Thanks. This book sounds fascinating. I can't wait to read it. And my question, and I'm sure you get asked this all the time, is did you find any people who you feel were better than even chance were actually descendants of your great-grandfather? I know that's not just the quest of the book, but were you able to locate any people?
It's a big spoiler, Richard, what you're asking me here to share.
That's true.
But it's okay. I will tell you. I will tell you. So I definitely met lots of people who were extraordinarily convinced that they were descendants of the lost Salamas, which is again indicative of this larger pattern, which was not only did so many Syrian Jews work in this way in the Andes, but a lot of Syrian Jews had these rumors and these legends about them that they had other families on the road, which is something that's maybe a bit taboo in the community and that people didn't talk about so much. But once you started asking questions, especially in those areas, a lot of people came up to me and said, oh yeah, like my mother was indigenous and my father was this mystery salesman, and I never knew him. And my mother brought that secret to her grave because she didn't want anybody to know who that was. So without, again, doing like DNA tests and comparing, it would be impossible to have proof. But no, I didn't find anybody even for whom the dates would have worked with my great-grandfather, just because it was such a vast search. And they wouldn't have had my last name. So that kind of, though it was the impulse for the journey, that was not ended up becoming the focus. And I started to rethink kind of like, what is the idea of these lost salamas? What is that actually, how does that manifest itself? And it comes back to that story, that word that I started, that phrase that I started this talk with, right? The kanya makan. It happened or it didn't happen. It was or it wasn't so. And all of the doubt that surrounds our family stories. And I'd like to pose this question to the group, which is, does it matter if our family legends are true? Does it matter if the family stories are true, or does it matter how those family stories change us and what journeys they lead us on in our own meaning of self-discovery? Because as family historians, we're craving stories of our own family's past in order to understand more about ourselves. And this story, this book, this project in many ways profoundly changed my life. Spanish, for example, was not part of the fabric of my existence before I went to Argentina looking in the Andes. And now it's, 50% of my life. I report all of my stories in Spanish, even though I write in English. I spend a lot of time each year in Argentina, and even in the United States, I work with Latin American communities in my journalism. So, and I speak with my grandparents in much more Spanish than I ever did before. So these lost salamas to me were less people, and they're more kind of traces of an identity that I never fully understood until I went looking for these illegitimate children, which ended up being these like traces of us that I found everywhere I turned. Why we are the way that we are because of the people who came before us. I hope that's a decent answer to.
No, that's a fantastic answer. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll interrupt just 1 second, Dora. Somebody in the chat quickly says, how can I get a copy of the map? It's printed in the book, but if people want it, you can reach out to me. And I'm going to put at the end of this and an email tomorrow, you're going to get information as to how to keep in touch with me. I'm happy to share it, but it is printed in the book.
Thank you. I'll read a question from the chat and I'll give the word to Leo afterwards. So Yafa is writing, coming from Mexico, it's curious to see that in the US, people ask about your ethnicity or race. How do you answer this question?
I'm really interested in this question, and it's a huge theme in the book as well, this question of identity, especially here in the United States, which is a country that's almost fixated on identity. I think it's really easy to feel like you're just one thing. You have to define yourself as just one thing. When in reality, so many of us are a big mix of things. And if you ask me who I am, I'm American, but I'm Syrian and Iraqi and Argentinian. But if the forms that you have to fill out asks me what I am, they ask me if I'm white or Hispanic / Latino, or even if there's a Middle Eastern option, or maybe there's a Jewish option, and these forms are so confusing, and we have all these conversations always. But yes, people always ask me about my ethnicity and my race, and I don't really have a good answer. I think it depends on the context. What I've found is that it's a really beautiful thing to be able to lean into the mixtures, depending on what community you want to build trust and become a part of. So if I'm speaking with other people from the Middle East, of course, I'll lean into my Arabic speaking roots. If I'm reporting on the Magdalena River in Colombia, of course, I'll lean into the fact that my family's from Argentina and talk about the World Cup and Messi and all these things. But these are little bridges of trust that open doors to conversations. And I think that once we start thinking of ethnicity, race, and identity as ways to begin building deeper and more sensitive relationships with people, rather than defining ourselves for any kind of fixed goal, that's what I'm most interested in. So I don't have a good answer. I define myself differently depending on what the context is.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Leo had his hand raised. So go ahead, but you need to unmute first.
Hi, Jordan. I read the book. I just finished it yesterday, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But I did get a little depressed reading it, and that's because I've always wanted to basically go on your journey and never had that opportunity. My family, my parents were born in Turkey. They spoke Ladino in the house. Unfortunately, me and my siblings never picked it up as a spoken language, and I've always regretted that. I tried going back to Turkey, but there's the town my father was born in we went to, but there are no Jews left.
Right.
And all we found was the cemetery. I also spent 2.5 months in Argentina, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, including 2 weeks in Mendoza.
Wow. Did your family go to Argentina, or your family came to the US from Turkey?
No, they came to the US. They came, my father, when he was alive, only had 5 brothers left. There were more prior to that. And the 5 brothers and 2 sisters came over basically 1 or 2 at a time. Again, same as in your family, to get away from the draft in Turkey. My father came over, I think in 1915, and
1950.
he was I think the fourth one to
Okay.
come over.
So it's really a lot of the things that you're saying is interesting here. The first thing that I want to talk about just briefly is language and maybe some of the reasons why Ladino wasn't transmitted to your generation or the generations later. And that's totally the case in so many of our families. I think that, I mean, let's just see a show of hands. Whose parents or grandparents spoke a language that either they spoke with each other because they didn't want the kids to understand, or they didn't pass it along for whatever reason because the later generations didn't want to learn anything. Almost everybody's raising their hand. This is so common. And one of the beautiful things is now with our Zoom worlds, there are actually a lot of resources for learning these languages, especially rare Jewish languages like Ladino and Judeo-Greek and Judeo-Baghdadi Arabic, for example, which is really cool. But it's totally like you're not the only one. And so many of us in our families, like for me, I grew up only speaking English, even though I had all these languages in my family. The only language they ever spoke to me was English, which is a very American thing. But the other thing that you're talking about, which is, wanting to go on this journey, but showing up and there only being a cemetery, is a really sad and really true Jewish reality. One of my dreams is to be able to go to Baghdad, where my mom was born, where she left in the 70s when she was 6 years old. And I know that if I go, there's going to be only 2 or 3 Jews there, and they're all in hiding. If I can go at all. These are tragedies, and they're very, very sad histories. However, it's also important to know, at least in the context of my book and my story, is that in the Andes, I went also to a place where there was largely nothing. There are very few Jewish people left in that region of Argentina. Mostly the people who are left are Syrian and Lebanese Christians. And I found that talking with them was actually super revelatory to illuminate my family's Jewish past. And I wonder that if kind of remembering your own conversations that you had in Turkey with people that weren't Jewish were revelatory in some ways, if you wrote that down, if you kept journals, and if not, another way of doing this, if you can't have the opportunity to travel at all, is to think about kind of analyzing objects that have been passed down in your family or songs that your family used to listen to, anything that gives color to your family's story, not just your family's documented history, but your family's story, is always a worthwhile experience. And I'm sure that you've read the book Cantica by Elizabeth Graver. Have you?
No.
Oh, okay. So a lot of people in this group have, but Leo, you should read this book immediately because it might have really beautiful, illuminative similarities to your family stories, much more than
Can you please tell me the name of that book again?
Sure. It's called Cantica. I'm going to put it in the chat here.
And actually, it's found on our website under book club because she also introduced the book on Qesher. So anybody who wants to see past book club events, they are on our website under the name book club, which also this event will be uploaded tomorrow.
And I'm going to be in conversation with Elizabeth about Cantica and my book at the Jewish Museum in New York. So if anybody here lives in New York City and wants to come in a couple of weeks, we're going to be there in person, and I'd love to meet you. And people are saying Cantica is a wonderful book. Renee says that actually clothing is great. Okay, so this kind of brings us back to this. So what I've been talking about, all of these traces. In my book, I call them marks of an existence. Again, these like kind of hidden, mundane, everyday ways that illuminate our family's stories, or at least evoke the memory of somebody who came before us. Clothing is one that people haven't necessarily mentioned so much in my conversations and in my workshops, but it's absolutely the case. So is music, so are accents, expressions, I don't know, languages we speak. Does anybody else have ideas? Throw them out in the chat or here. These marks of an existence, household items. I don't know. There's so many examples of this, of how stories are kind of embedded within the objects and evocations of our everyday lives. It's really, really special.
Thank you.
Yeah, Leo, I would encourage you to look into that. Yeah.
There was another question by Sherry. If Syrian Jewish immigrants also formed aid societies or groups together to help each other the way Ashkenazi Jews did in New York City.
They did in Argentina. They did, but actually, interestingly, it was combined with other religious groups from the Ottoman Empire. So like the Syrian Lebanese Society of Argentina it's not just explicitly a Jewish organization, but it's like a mutual aid organization for Syrian Christians and Lebanese Christians and Muslims too, and Armenians. And in Argentina, coexistence among ethnic and religious groups from the Ottoman Empire in diaspora is a lot more close-knit in business and in other elements than maybe it is in other countries, which is a really special and amazing, beautiful thing. And then in addition to that, of course, Syrian Jews formed more traditional communities. Of course, there's Syrian Jewish synagogues and schools and even like country clubs, where a lot of the people who belong to the country club, where they have houses within these compounds of all Jewish people for sports and recreation, a lot of them are Syrian Jews. So there's all sorts of community building, but the Syrian Lebanese society was the most similar thing to what you're describing, Sherry.
Thank you. Carol?
There's a story of a woman who was packing up clothes for her children to send them to Kinderhostel to leave Poland and, perhaps never see them again. They were going to England to strangers, and she put a beautiful serving spoon in there. The last thing she had, a silver spoon, and she said, then you'll know where you came from. I thought it was a sweet story.
A silver spoon, then you'll know where they came from. It's beautiful. It's so sad. And also, but like, if nobody records that, right? Like that testimony of the silver spoon, eventually the silver spoon will become just a silver spoon.
Right.
And so much of the message of this, right, is like recording those stories that accompany the heirlooms.
I think it was translated a little differently. It was translated as they'll know you came from someone, someone important, because it was a sterling spoon, a serving spoon.
They'll know you came from someone. Wow. One thing I want to mention quickly that's kind of related to this and the importance of well, I talk a lot about the importance of writing things down. I am kind of obsessed with documenting, I think, because I've grown up with this fear of forgetting, in the sense that I'm going to be the generation that's going to forget these stories or not pass on these languages, or not, I don't know, that we're going to be the ones to lose the traditions, basically. And especially when you come from places like my family comes from, where you don't see yourself necessarily reflected in other Jewish people in your community, that fear is heightened. And so I think that that's why I wanted to become a journalist in the first place. But I write things down and document things in all sorts of ways. I keep little lists, like in my wallet and my pockets, of details that I pass in everyday life. I record conversations. I write a lot of handwritten letters. It's just become my personality to document in this way. Because a historian in Argentina said this to me. She said it in a really beautiful way. She said, make sure that everything is written down, because generations from now, if someone comes looking for us and we've been all but forgotten, what you've written down will be what will make us remembered. And I think that's so important. And I've been thinking about so much of this with like inscription and that. And I wanted to show you all this before we go, which is a kind of very special guest book. When I do in-person events in other places, in cities around the US, I ask people to sign this book with their name, their contact information, but most importantly with their heritage. And so you can see that depending on what city we're doing the events in, you can learn a lot about what that population looks like that's coming out for the events. And also what we're able to do is build communities of seekers, of people who are, let's say, like Leo, who's hoping to learn more about his Turkish Jewish family's past, but doesn't know kind of where to start. Well, we're building these communities where you can connect with other Turkish or Sephardic descended Jews to share resources and all sorts of things. Now, of course, I wish that all of you could sign this guest book in person, but I have a version of it online that I'm sharing in the chat now. So if anybody wants to go and inscribe yourself there in the book, I'm going to end up printing those out too and put them in this guest book to share around for the events. That's something I wanted to mention before we keep going with the questions, because it's also a way for us to kind of keep the community together and to keep in touch. There is nothing like handwritten letters, but Yafa asks, writing down digitally, physically, or both. When I say writing it down, I mean it can be digitally too, or it can mean recording something, like putting a video camera in front of a family member and asking them to tell a story, or recording audio of a conversation. Just making sure that things exist in a more physical form than just memory is I think, very important.
Thank you so much. And there were some comments also about the differences between searching for family in the Sephardi Mizrahi world versus Eastern Europe, for example, where you can look for archives or documents in different towns. So that was just an interesting comment as well, if you also want to comment on it.
I think that that's a really astute observation, and something that I have had to grapple with my whole life, being really the only like fully non-Ashkenazi Jewish kid in my town, in my high school, in my, Hebrew school. Like, there was nobody like me. And so when it came time for me to try to understand my family story, seemed to be like the only kid relying on oral histories in like a weird mix of languages, some of which I did not understand. And I think that that it's true, and maybe one of the reasons is just because in the United States, the proportion of Ashkenazi Jews versus Sephardic or Mizrahi Jews is it's very unbalanced. I think it's like 90% to 10% in the United States. So there's just a lot more documentation and resources. It's also the case that in a lot of Arabic-speaking countries, the documentation has been destroyed or withheld, or it's very hard to travel to these places. So there's all sorts of reasons why somebody like me or like Leo might want to look for these stories, but find just traces of disappearance and not necessarily know where to start, and then have to come up with more creative ways to answer these questions. But thankfully, my whole job is trying to investigate things like a reporter, and I was able to apply those and create a fluid experience. It's true.
So I don't see now more questions, but we still have a few minutes. So if someone wants to ask anything else, then you can still raise your hand or put it in the chat. I just want to let you know in the meantime that tomorrow we will send out a follow-up email in which we'll include also the guest book, also the recording of this talk, and of course also where you can buy this book. I think I saw it in the beginning, actually, a question about that, if the book can be found on paperback or hardcover, and if it can be found in libraries. I think someone asked that question in the beginning.
Yeah, all of the above. This book you can get at any place where you buy books. So Barnes & Noble or your local bookstore, you can call and order it if they don't have it. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at your local library. I actually would love it if you called your local library and asked for it, because it means that they'll have a copy forever. And that to me is really special, because it makes the book so much more accessible for people. So if you want to take the time to call your local library and ask them to stock a copy of Stranger in the Desert, that would make me really happy. There will also be an audiobook that I'm recording as we speak in the next couple of weeks. So I can't wait to share that with you too. What was something that I wanted to say, Dora, based on what you'd mentioned something, and I lost my train of thought
Well, there's an interesting question here. Is it possible to find Iraqi Jewish history in written form?
Yeah, there it is, and it's actually much more available than Syrian Jewish history, for example. What I've found, like, my Iraqi side is so much better, more well documented than Syrian side. If you're looking for it in English, which is what I would imagine, Iraqi Jewish history, there's a couple of books that I would really highly recommend. One is called My Father's Paradise by a guy named Ariel Sabar. Really, really wonderful book. Another one is called When the Gray Beetles Took Over Baghdad by Mona Yahya, who went to school with my aunt. And then there is something called The Scribe, which is a newspaper for the Iraqi Jewish community in diaspora. And it's written in English from a family in London, and it's been written for decades. They've actually just revived it. So if you're looking for Iraqi Jewish resources, there's so much available, which is so, so, so great.
Thank you. And there were a few more questions. I'll read 2 or 3 more questions, and then we will close for today. Can you explain the title of your book?
I can, because some people see the title of the book and they're like, well, is it really a desert in the Andes? And I say, well, that's a very good point. It's like dry, deserted looking mountains and high deserts and plateaus. But why did I call it Stranger in the Desert? And actually it comes back to a Jewish quote, which is, you shall open your door to the stranger because we were strangers in the desert, or strangers in Egypt, right? And also this idea that the Jewish people, in their time wandering in the desert, kind of in the biblical story, right? In those 40 years wandering in the desert, the Jewish people became Jewish for the first time. We found our identity. And this title is actually an allusion to that story and how wandering and opening your door to strangers and letting yourself be welcomed into people's homes and welcoming others into your homes, into your home as well, can give you more of a sense of identity than you could have ever imagined in the past. So that's the title.
Thank you. And will you be the one reading the audiobook?
I will be. And thank you for the comment. I am glad to hear that you think that I have a nice voice. That means a lot to me.
Great. So when will that be out?
I don't know when it's going to be out, but I know that in the next
Okay.
few weeks we're going to be recording it. Hopefully this spring.
Okay, great. So send us the link where it's accessible to buy when it's out, and then we will edit below the recording when it's done. So there's one more question I will ask. What is the safest way to record someone on a cell phone? I'm not sure if Carla, if you want to ask, because I saw that you asked it several times. So if you want to ask what you mean exactly, then please feel free to unmute. And just while I wait for give one moment to that, I'll just say that a few more words about what our events are going to be this week. It's going to be a very different topic because we actually have two Eastern European talks coming up. On Thursday, we will have a talk about the Jews of Ukraine, and on Sunday about Polish Jews and the Warsaw ghetto remains and the revival of Warsaw as well. So these are the two events that are still waiting for us this week. But of course, we'll send you also our upcoming events in the follow-up email. And our next book event, however, will be also Sephardic. It will be Ruth Behar, and she wrote a book, Across So Many Seas, which also follows through a very similar storyline, what Jordan mentioned, but in slightly different stops. It's a family that also went through Spain and Cuba and the US. So it's going to be also very, very interesting. Okay, so I think we will close it for today because now I don't see more questions.
I can answer the recording question, Dora. Just
okay,
quickly.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I think safe meaning like in terms of privacy, it's perfectly fine to record on a cell phone, like using the voice memo app in an iPhone, for example. You can also buy really cheap and really excellent voice recorders that can record hours and hours and hours, and they cost about $10 or $15. So that's also a wonderful resource.
Thank you. So you understood the question. That's the most important.
I assume that was what the question was.
Yes, probably it was. So thank you so much, Jordan, for sharing with us your book and your story and opening up all these interesting questions and stories in between us during this Zoom. It was really nice to hear also from all of you a little bit of your own stories, and it was so nice that you guys were involved. So thank you for everyone who participated and listened and was here. And as I mentioned before, we will be in touch tomorrow, so you will receive all the information, and I'll pass the word back to Jordan to close.
Yeah, I just want to close with one last thing, which is that I think that when we're going on these journeys and thinking about our family stories, it's really easy to feel like you're the only one. Like you're the only one whose family is the way that they are. Like you're the only one whose great-grandparents did a certain thing or moved around in a certain way, or that you're the only one who can't figure it out. You're the only one who's hit a dead end. And what I hope this book shows everybody, and what I hope you feel when you read this book and you read my story, is that you're not the only one. Stranger in the Desert as a title also kind of suggests a sense of wandering loneliness. And I think it's very, very easy to feel lonely, especially in a place like the United States where we all have different stories. My hope with this book is that you understand that we are all together in this, that we're all seeking these questions together. And even if our backgrounds and experiences are distinct, we're all following that same path. And that's why I want to create this. I want to use this book to start more of these conversations in more targeted communities, to try to give people the resources to think about creative ways that they can make this really meaningful for their own families. So please get in touch. In the email tomorrow, you'll get that guest book link. I would love to hear from you and to keep this conversation going, because it's so much more than a book talk. It's so much more than a book. This is a community that I really want to build. So thank you all for being here, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Have a good evening.
Take care. Thank you.